Hi, Petrea. It's so nice to have you on the Dying Your Way podcast. I am so excited to have you here. I think a lot of my listeners will know who you are. This is Petrea King. She is the founder and CEO of Quest for Life. And she is an international speaker, an author. She's a meditation teacher, a facilitator. I could go on, but you have really opened up the awareness like I really haven't seen in-depth literacy and the value that comes with helping people with a terminal illness or trauma of any kind. You've just really pioneered and opened that up here, specifically in Australia, but I think for other people globally as well. So thank you so much for being on today. We are just absolutely thrilled to have you here.
No, it's a real pleasure, Claire. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Hey, we have something that's kind of unique that's in common, the two of us. You are the only other person that I know that has read the Bible twice.
Oh, we must be a sick two women.
Well, you know what? I don't know why I did, but I just really wanted to delve into it that way, and I'm kind of a cover to cover kind of person. Yeah, so I was like not going to skip around. I was going to do it front to back, and I've done that twice. So yeah, you're unique like that. And we also love Assisi. I love Assisi.
Yes. Yeah. Assisi is a very special place on the planet, and there's a sweetness in the hills around Assisi that I found very healing.
I haven't done any more than spend, a long day there, but going down into St. Francis's, where his tomb is, where you go down the staircase and it's silent signs everywhere. And you're really with a large group of tourist type people who are going down those stairs and sitting in meditation. And they don't even know what meditation is for most of them. And they are just drawn into that energy that is like kind of indescribable, really.
Yes, and I think where I spent several months in the little cave outside of Assisi, about 4.5 kilometers up the mountain from Assisi, and there's a tiny little cave that's really only about the size of a bed, a single bed at that. And I spent several months in that little cave, and there's an energy in the walls of that place where St. Francis used to go to for reflection and prayer to get away from downtown Assisi. And I needed to get away from downtown Assisi because I just found the noise and lights and sounds just far too much. But that little cave just absolutely drew me into its soul.
For people that haven't been to Assisi, it's in Italy, and it's like in this huge expansive plain, and then there's like this kind of plateau kind of mountain that the whole village is built on. It's just
and of course it's all built in pink rock, so when the sun hits it late in the day it just glows pink. It's quite remarkable.
And I always had an affinity for St. Clare, so she was a disciple of St. Francis, so I loved it.
I loved St. Francis because he kind of put it up the church, which I liked. And also he had a passion for nature and animals. And he wasn't interested in dogma. He was a free spirit in many ways and was willing to challenge the system. So there were many aspects of his character that I really admired and felt I had a little bit of that cheekiness within myself as well. Even though it might have been buried at the time.
Hey, you have an amazing story that I want you to talk about as much as you want to, but I think it would really be helpful to put into context the conversation that we're going to have about death and dying, because you have actually received a terminal diagnosis, and I'll just let you tell the story, but it's that story and your brother's story. It's just so unique to have you positioned doing what you're doing now. So share a little.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. I was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia in 1983, and my children were 4 and 7, and I was told in September that I wouldn't see Christmas of that year. And, you know, it came on the heels of a lot of other trauma. My husband and I had just moved to America to do our yoga and meditation teacher training. We'd only been there for 4 weeks when I thought he'd gone for a long walk, but he'd returned to Australia with the money. So that left me with 2 small children in a little geodesic dome out in the wilds of the Sierra Nevada mountains. And just before that, my brother had taken his life after telling me before we were both 10 that he knew he had to take his own life by the time he was 30. And so as a little girl, I'd always taken that on as that's the purpose of my existence. I am here to make sure that Brendan stays safe.
What a huge burden for a child.
I know. And when I actually went back and kind of embraced that little 9-year-old girl who took on that responsibility, there were a lot of tears, because I remember thinking to myself, I have to grow up really quickly now so I can look after Brendan. And I promptly grew 23 centimetres, 9 inches, in the next 15 months, and that deranged the bone growth in my legs. And so I left school just before my 13th birthday, and I had the next 3 years in hospital having my femurs cut, my lower legs turned out, my tibias cut and turned in, and then my knees swiveled in again. So they did that all over again, and they transplanted tendons and shortened muscles and lengthened other ones. So actually being in hospital was fantastic, because physical pain I could deal with. The emotional pain of seeing my brother already tumbling into despair and depression, I just found an agony.
Yeah.
And so while I was in hospital, I read voraciously. And, you know, I read the Bible twice. I read the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, Thomas Merton, Aldous Huxley, Krishnamurti, Alan Watts, all of these, because I was so consumed with, why are we here?
Yeah.
What is the point of human existence? And how do you know that you've lived the life you came here to live? And of course, I didn't really find answers in those books, but I found a pathway. And then a whole lot of other traumas happened. I was sexually assaulted while I was actually in a back brace, because I'd hurt my back.
You were a child? You were sexually assaulted?
I was 17 when I was, because I was terribly naive, you know. I'd had 3 years in hospital. I'd finally come out of hospital. I went into nursing, which wasn't that bright after all that surgery. I hurt my back, and it was actually at a church fellowship meeting. And I was lying down in one of the bedrooms, and this man came in, and I didn't even think of it as rape, because he didn't have a gun, he didn't have a knife. I just didn't have a voice.
Well,
and I was so
that's something else we have in common.
Yeah, I was so used to splitting off, and you can do what you like to my body, I'm not even here. And gradually, you know, I didn't tell anyone about that experience either. By 21, I was quite crippled with arthritis and walked with walking sticks. So that's why I got interested in diet and the power of the mind. Because at one stage I'd been in traction for 9 months with one of my, when they cut my femur. And I didn't know how, but I knew I was withholding healing from that leg, because I knew I had to go back to school if that bone healed, and there was no way I could cope with school. I just could not cope with the numbers of people. You know, I was very small for my age. I just didn't feel like I had what it took to grow up. And Brendan was just ahead of me, making a bit of a mess of it anyway. So I studied naturopathy. I studied voraciously for years. And because I knew the mind had a lot to do with the body, the only place I really found any depth of understanding in that was actually through the Upanishads. The Vedas have quite a lot of information about psychoneuroimmunology. They just didn't call it that. And so I wanted to do our yoga and meditation teacher training. And so Brendan died, I moved to America, my husband disappeared, and then just after that I was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. And I have to say my first reaction was relief, because I'd lived with chronic pain all my life. And I also lived with a split reality. I was someone incredibly private to myself. And then there was the me that I kept highly polished for everyone else. And I remember hearing myself say one day, I'd rather be dead than continue living like this.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, here I am sitting in this little cave in Assisi, dying. And I saw that realization, I'd rather be dead than continue living a life that's not authentic, basically.
Yeah.
And so obviously I didn't die. I can't say why I didn't. I did have 2 near-death experiences. And so I know that dying is the best thing that ever happens to you while you're alive.
Yeah.
Because when you're dead, you're not. You're more alive than ever.
Yeah.
Um,
Could you just give us one of your death experiences that led you to believe that?
mm. Well, it wasn't that I was dying at the time. The first one, it's a bit of a longer story, but I was working with a Swami at the time when I was diagnosed, Swami Kriyananda, as his housekeeper and secretary. And so we'd ended up going to Italy, and the 7 leaders of the Catholic Church, a charismatic Catholic church, and there ain't nothing like an Italian charismatic church.
Imagine, I can imagine.
The singing
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
just unbelievable.
Yeah.
Anyway, unbeknownst to me, this entire service that I was attending was for my benefit, but no one had kind of told me that, and I didn't speak Italian. They didn't really speak much English. So I was just meditating during this beautiful service and this amazing singing. And then the 7 leaders of the church, including the Swami, put their hands on me, on my head, and my head went back and I could not move for 4.5 hours.
Wow.
And it was just bliss, just divine bliss, a light like no other,
Yeah.
a throng like no other. And I knew everything that was happening. I knew the people had all left the service. They were upstairs. Some of them were waiting to take me home. But I could not come back from this divine, blissful state. And it took me, I don't know how long, but I had several attempts of just, it was like taking on a cement block again.
Yeah.
And so finally I came back into my body, but a little bit reluctantly. And the second time was in the cave where St. Francis used to retreat to. And in that experience, my children came into my awareness. And I saw them as ancient beings on their own ancient journey, and that they were absolutely fine whether I lived or died. Now, sitting here today as a grandma of those children, I can't even begin to understand how I could have not thought, but known in my depths that these were ancient beings on their own ancient journey. Our lives had intersected and we were precious to one another, but they were not mine.
Wow.
And they were on their own ancient journey back home. So those 2 experiences completely dissolved any fear that I had around dying. Living is difficult. Dying is bliss. That doesn't mean we're in a rush to get there, because if you're alive and breathing, you've got work to do.
But so many people do everything they can to push away their own mortality or a reality that everybody is going to die. So many people push that away. So you've worked with literally over 100,000 people. Probably, I don't even know how large the number is now, that come to you with a terminal illness or some form of trauma. What leads them to want to know about death literacy? What kind of person seeks that kind of help, because I just experienced so many people just pushing the whole idea and concept away in such a painful way because they're pushing it away. How are they when they come to you? Why do they come?
I don't think they come to talk about, although we do, I don't think they come thinking, I'm going to die and I want to find out about death and dying.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they come for that reason. And in some ways, I'd say I don't know any dying people. You know, I think you're either alive or you're dead.
Yeah.
And when you're dead, you're not.
Mm-hmm.
But while you're alive, you need all of the love and care and compassion and respect due to any living being.
Mm-hmm.
And so people come really to find, how do I live well in the midst of this? And what might I do, in addition to whatever I'm doing medically, what might I do to contribute to my own quality of life? Because they know that there are conversations that need to be had. Maybe there's pain that needs to be managed. Maybe there are past traumas that need to be resolved.
Yeah.
Maybe there are dreams that have been shattered. Maybe there are any number of tattered relationships that they want to attend to, because with the thought of your mortality on the near horizon, there's a sense that we want our life to have been as completed as possible. But I don't, you know, at one stage I cleaned out the bottom drawer and wrote the will and the funeral and had all those long overdue conversations with my parents about issues from the past. So I got my life all up to date.
Mm-hmm.
And then the plane got cancelled. You know, I was all expecting to go, and then yeah, and it was like, how much do you unpack? And I realized that whilst I was preparing in those ways for my death, actually, I really like to live with my financial and legal affairs in order.
Yeah.
I like my personal, emotional relationships to be in order. I like my bottom drawer vaguely tidy, because I know that life can change in a moment. It can change in a breath, in a phone call, in one conversation, and it's never the same again.
Yeah.
So I realized that whilst I thought I was doing it to prepare to die, it's actually a great way to live, with
Yeah.
your emotional, psychological relationships in good order, your finances, your legal affairs in good order. So I've lived like that ever since. I quite like having death on my shoulder,
Well, we both
because it's
do.
a constant reminder
Yeah.
that this moment is precious. This encounter is precious. And we need to turn up 100% to every moment of our life.
Yeah.
So I think when people come to us, it's, how do I live in the midst of this challenge? And how do I find peace in the midst of this challenge? Because we know from epigenetics that peace is not just a state of mind, it's actually a physiology in our body.
So talk, because people may want a definition of epigenetics and how that relates to what we're talking
Yeah.
about.
Well, last century we thought all diseases were genetically determined. And
Mm-hmm.
if we could just find the problematic gene and snip it off, we'd
Mm-hmm.
have world peace. You know, we'll snip off depression and anxiety and breast cancer, and we'll snip off all of these genes for these various conditions, and then we'll all be happy. Such a lovely, simplistic way of looking at the world. This century, we know from epigenetics, epi means above genetics,
Yeah.
that it's the environment around the cell which is impacted by what you're eating and drinking, the quality of your sleep, the quality of your exercise, the chemistry of your emotions, and the chemicals that are in the environment. That's what's in the environment that surrounds every cell of your body. And through the receptor sites on the surface of every cell, they're informing the interior of the cell, and the chemical electrical messages that they give into the cell are what is causing the gene to express, to modify its expression, or to suppress.
Mm.
And so when you change what's in the epigenetic environment by improving your nutrition and what you're drinking, by improving the quality and depth of your sleep, by managing your exercise in the way that you can for your particular body, by understanding the impact that the chemistry of your emotions is having and how you can work with that, and
Mm.
by eliminating as many of the chemicals in your environment as possible, you are literally changing the chemical messages that are going in through those receptor sites and are telling the gene how to express. So that's why we see people don't die on time if they've been given a time by their doctor.
And
And
is
it's
that what you account, is that what you attribute to possibly why your terminal illness was delayed or altered
yes,
completely because of that?
probably. But bear in mind, in those 3 years I had in hospital as a 13, 14, 15-year-old, I had hundreds of x-rays. And they just invented portable x-ray machines, which they used to bring to my bedside.
Mm.
And they didn't always remember to bring the big, heavy
Lead, paper.
protection blanket.
Yeah.
And some weeks I had 3 x-rays in 1 week. And I was in traction for 9 months. So I had a lot of x-rays at that time. And I suspect, I don't know, I suspect that the combination of the grief and guilt, because I failed to save my brother. He
Yeah.
did take his life in Kathmandu. There
Yeah.
was no body, no funeral, no memorial. It was very challenging. So the grief was complicated by a deep sense of the guilt that I had made that commitment when I was 9 years old and I had failed.
Mm.
So that was very challenging. Then the separation, the move to America, the separation from my husband. Um, I think it was a combination of all of those things that I was very, very low at that time. And we know that grief impacts the immune system quite considerably, especially when it's complicated or complex grief. But I'm not saying that's the reason. I don't know. All I know is that my orthopedic surgeons these days certainly never give me x-rays and they're very convinced that that's exactly what caused it. So.
Well, and from what you described about what you call the near-death experience in that Italian charismatic church also sounded like the laying on of hands and the gift of the Holy Spirit just basically could have been doing a major healing on you right there, and it was a
Indeed.
miracle.
Indeed. And before I went to Italy, my mother was on our local parish council of the Anglican Church, and she was keen for me to have an anointing. And I was a bit past, the whole Anglican Church thing, because I'd been meditating since I was 17. And so I agreed to it really for my mum. But when I knelt at the communion rail and the minister, John Seddon, made the sign of the cross on my forehead and on my heart, there was just this blinding love. And my reaction to that was, yes, I know there is only love, but I can't have that. I'm a rotten, miserable worm. I don't deserve to exist. And it was as if Jesus was saying, what? There is only love.
There is.
Yes, I know there's only love, but I can't have that. And I saw this tussle that went on, and I realized the only thing that ever stops us from experiencing the presence of profound love is what's going on inside our own brain. And that's not the truth of who we are in our essence. It's what we have acquired. It's become second nature to us to see the world that way.
I think it's always there. That love, that joy, that bliss is always there. We're just not in tune to it. We don't recognize it. We're not, but it's there. We're just not living in that all the time.
So. Exactly, because we're preoccupied with either, being in the past and chewing over things that happened in the past, or resenting, blaming, shaming, rewriting history, Or our brain is busy telling us stories of the future, you know, what might happen, could happen, probably won't happen. And we project our fears and worries and concerns. Whereas we also know from neuroplasticity now that we can harness the brain to be entrained in the present moment. And when the brain is fully focused in the present moment, we have access to wonderful qualities that we only have when the brain is in our service: insight, intuition, wisdom, humor, spontaneity, creativity, and compassion. And these are the...
Can you hear the rain?
I'm sorry?
Can you hear the rain?
Is it raining?
Pouring down rain, which I always take to think about blessings, which is like coming down on us. It's pouring down rain while you're talking.
Ah, beautiful. The heavens have opened.
Yeah. So I didn't want to interrupt what you were saying, but I also wanted to talk to you about, because I haven't been to your foundation or the location where people come for this retreat site, but it just sounds like a beautiful model of how a community supports other people in their community. And I wish you would talk a little bit about how you see the responsibility that communities have to the vulnerable population, you know, certainly terminally ill people, but really any of the terminal or vulnerable people that we have in our community. What is that responsibility, and how can we re-envision a way that communities can better support patients and their families?
I think it's happening. You know, there's this groundswell of people now who want to take back control over how perhaps they conduct the funeral or how they care for their loved one. And, you know, so I think it's definitely happening far more than when I started this work some 35 years ago. And, you know, I was known back in the 80s as a midwife for the dying. Because I used to talk about we get so much help in getting in here, but we don't get any assistance in taking our leave. And I often used to move into the homes of young mums if they were dying, or children if they were dying, and just being in the background, but ensuring that everything gets said and done, that people are comfortable with what's happening, that we can be creative in how we care for this person, so that it's as beautiful an experience as it can be, given the great sadness that is also accompanying the parting. And so now, of course, they're called doulas, but it was very much part of my role back in the 80s, where, for instance, there was a little boy, Charlie, and he was one of my great teachers. And Charlie had a cancer around the prostate, a rhabdomyosarcoma around the prostate. So if anything passed through, and he was only 9 when I met him and 10 when he died, if anything passed through the rectum, it caused this paroxysm of pain, very like a labour contraction. And everyone would disappear. His mum would go to draw up more morphine. His dad couldn't bear being around so much pain in his son when he couldn't fix it, he couldn't change it, he couldn't make it better. And his siblings found it very difficult too. And Charlie would just disappear and go grey or blue and sweat, and it was very hard to witness. And I moved in with the family, and, you know, it's in the not knowing sometimes that great inspiration comes. And I said to him one day, because he never got held anymore, you know, he had an adult-sized suprapubic catheter in, and it kept blocking up with clots. And I said, you know, how about we sit you forward in the bed and I'll sit behind you and I'll have your head up here on my chest and you can just lie in my arms. Well, we did that. And from then until he died 2 weeks later, 24 hours a day, Charlie lay in someone's arms. And for a long time, his dad wouldn't get in the bed because he knew that if one of these pain things happened, he wouldn't be able to escape. But finally, he did get into bed with little Charlie, and it was beautiful to see Charlie asleep in his dad's arms and his father weeping the tears that he needed to weep and stroking his son. And, you know, it didn't change the fact that Charlie died, but it changed the way we all ventured through that together. And we were in there very much together with Charlie every inch of the way. Another thing I did with him, I took his hands at one stage and said, how about we try and breathe through this like it's a labor contraction? And so I took his hands and we just maintained eye contact and we breathed our way through it. And then his 14-year-old sister said, can I try that with Charlie? And then his brother did. And, you know, it just involved the family so that we were all engaged in this very sad, sad event, but we were there together and we ventured into the caverns of hell together and we emerged out the other side. And to this day, we're still firm friends.
Well, and they had that, you could say, beautiful experience and sad experience because they were not pushing it away, not putting it in a hospital. It was at home. It was the family involved in it. And honestly, I think about the people that are dying in ICUs with COVID and their family can't be with them. And it just breaks my heart knowing how difficult it is, not only for the dying patient, but the families and the professionals that are taking care of them.
I think there's going to be so much trauma come out of this time for people. This will add a whole layer of complication to grief for people. And I'm sure we're going to see many people here at Quest who found, you know, losing someone. We've had so few losses in a way in Australia, which has been such a blessing, but certainly not for the 100+ people and their families who are completely bereft. And it's got so many complications of responsibility and guilt and not being there and not being able to utter those words that sometimes don't get uttered until right at the end.
Yeah.
And you know, they've missed out on all of that. So I imagine there's going to be a great deal of pain and anguish amongst those who've lost relatives through the COVID experience.
Well, I mean, it's sad, but I'm glad that you're there and you're even thinking ahead that that's going to be a need that you'll be able to provide, you know?
Yeah. The other thing too that I wanted to say is, you know, I stopped using terminal about people a long time ago. I think terminals are for buses and trains and computers, because when I was told I was terminal, it felt like an annihilation of my existence, when really they're just talking about your physical body. And so I tend to think of, you know, we're living with a life-threatening illness rather than dying with a terminal one.
Right.
And it's just a shift in perspective that helps me to see that everybody's very much alive until they're not. And how are we going to care for them? Because I've been at bedsides where people have been talking about the funeral or who's going to get what possessions over the person who's still very much with us. And indeed, I believe people are hearing right to the very end.
They do.
And that what you say in their presence is really important. And the same as, you know, doctors may walk into a room and say all manner of things around an unconscious patient. And I learned that when I was 17, when I was nursing, when we had a woman who was unconscious after a car accident for 17 months. And I was terribly diligent as a 17-year-old, and every time I went to wash her or tend to her, I'd chat about the weather, what I was doing on the weekend, how was she, I hope she was comfortable, and I just talked to her. And then I came back from night duty after 4 nights off one time, and they said, Mrs. O'Sullivan has woken up. And I walked into the room and she said, you're the one You're the one who kept talking to me. And she said those wretched doctors would stand at the foot of my bed and say that I was unlikely to come out of this. And I couldn't communicate to them, but you would just chat about inane things. And so I was very conscious from then on.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great story.
Mm.
Well, what in this challenging time that we've all been through, have you thought about or seen a silver lining in any of this? Because I think everything's going to things won't go back to normal the way we knew them. Maybe
Yeah.
more so in Australia than in the United States, but is there a silver lining in this?
I think many of us were ready for a change.
Yeah.
And I think this time, I think there have been many silver linings. There have been some huge challenges too, but people have had to be confronted with their own beliefs and judgments, and there's been no escape because we've been told to stay at home and be with ourselves. And when we're with ourselves, up comes all of the inner dialogue that keeps most people preoccupied all day. So I think people have had to do a lot of self-reflection, and some people, I imagine, have thought, I don't want to go back to how things were. Maybe now's the time to fulfill the dream. Maybe I want to work a shorter week. Maybe I want to go into a different career. I really am going to train for that role now, after this time. And the other great silver lining that's come out of it is that we've shifted to online programs at this time.
Here we are.
3-day, 4-day online programs. And we have been amazed at how intimate, how personal, how warm, how compassionate the participants are to one another.
Mhm.
And so even though we expect to have participants back at the centre in our programs in July of 2020, I know that the online programs will continue long into the future
Yeah.
because it helps our reach out to everyone in Australia and indeed beyond Australia.
Mm.
So, the online capacities of providing deep education and emotional support to people who are really struggling has been incredibly impressive.
Mm.
And that's something that will certainly continue into the future.
Yeah. I really would hope that through telemedicine and because of the horrible experience that's been happening in ICUs with family not being able to be with their loved one, that people will rethink about dying at home. I mean, 80% of people do want to die at home. And
Exactly.
I'm not saying don't get the care that you need, but when the time's right and if it's appropriate for you and if that's what you want, that one thing Australia has that they don't have in the United States is that kind of community nursing like Silver Chain, and they don't have that there. So, I mean, if you had people able to stay at home through community nursing and home health aides and telemedicine and, early palliative care, that there would be a whole paradigm shift in care for people at the end of their life. I would love to see that be an outcome.
Yes. Well, I think just as we've had breast care nurses now that accompany a woman throughout from diagnosis all the way through, we need that for everyone. I think the palliative care person needs to be at the diagnosis. I'm going to be your buddy through here, because to palliate is to ease suffering. And sometimes a person needs to ease suffering right at the very beginning of the journey. And it's often the palliative care people who know about constipation and diarrhea and night sweats and how to minimize all of these things. So I'd love to see that person journey all the way through, either to say, goodbye and go have a fabulous life, or I'm right here and I will walk you to the gate, to the edge of life, and you can count on me being here. And I also think that we need to take back into our communities the rights of community care for people who want to die at home.
Yeah.
because you don't need to pay a fortune for private nursing, which a lot of people end up having to do, uh, and can ill afford to do, because this person needs more physical care perhaps than I feel capable or even physically strong enough perhaps to provide. But to pay for 24/7 nursing care in the home is prohibitive for most people. So to have the community engaged and able to offer practical supportive care, things like, you know, providing food for the partners so that they can just focus on being with their loved one, people doing the cleaning, doing the whatever needs to be done so that these people can really venture through this difficult time supported and really cared for by the community.
Yeah.
So I think we've still got a long, long way to go to take back some level of control in caring for people at home.
Mm.
I'd also love to see here at Quest and in other places a cottage hospice, you know, that is like a home, and there's just one or two beds there, and it's either for respite or if a family can't care for someone at home, that they can still come and have an evening meal together with their loved one. But they can go home and get a good night's sleep while they know that their loved one is being tended to by volunteers who will absolutely take very good care of that person while the family, because sometimes, you know, if it's a child perhaps, the parents may still have many other children. They have work commitments, they have financial commitments. So knowing that their child who's dying is being cared for lovingly and that they can still come and have meals and visits, but it's in a homely environment rather than a hospice or a hospital environment. I think, you know, I'd love to see those spring up everywhere as well.
Sounds like you're going to do it. Great.
Well, quite a long list of priorities.
Well, you've talked a lot about your own personal experience with death and dying. So I actually ask everybody at the end of a conversation, you know, the rhetorical question of what is death? But I think you have a really great insight into your own mortality and how you see that. How do you see your own mortality when that time comes? How do
Oh,
you,
look,
how do you want it to be?
I'm looking forward to a good long rest. I hope I get one of those before I have to come back again or something. Surely this is enough. Look, I feel, I think it was Plato that said, practice dying daily.
Mm-hmm.
When they said, what should we do? He said, practice dying. And I think in meditation, we die to what is second nature to us every day.
Yes.
And we find respite and refuge in our first nature. It's interesting we call it second nature. You know, people say, oh, it's second nature for me to think like this, feel like this, react in this way. And no one ever questions, what's your first nature? What was there before you took on all of that?
Yeah.
And so in meditation, we can experience our first nature. And when you're comfortable resting in the being of your own self, then you're liberated from suffering, liberated from the body. So I think death is liberation, and liberation from the heaviness and the cement-like experience of being in a body.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I meditate regularly. I know the benefits of that, and it's something that I mean, you teach meditation every Monday night. People go Facebook Live, and you are teaching it.
Yes, every Monday evening at 7:30.
7:30, but that's Australian Eastern Standard
Eastern time, yes.
Yeah. So, but anybody around the globe could just go to your website,
Oh, and they do.
questlife.com.au, and
Yeah.
I understand you have quite a few people that are doing that every Monday night, right?
Yeah, sometimes up to 1,000 people. And, they're in America and Kazakhstan and Malaysia and London and all over the place. And then they remain online so people can access them afterwards according to their time zone as well.
You just do so much for so many people for so long. I mean, it's really one of my great honors through our mutual friend Julian to meet you and to, yeah, just know the work that you're doing and what a difference it makes for people. I just am so, so grateful to you and what you
Oh,
do. And
thank you, Claire. It's been really lovely talking to you. The thing is, when you nearly die and then you don't, you know that happiness is not about the stuff.
it's not
It's
about,
actually about relationship. It's about love. And really, I think all of us, and certainly me, when I arrive on my deathbed, uh, not too far off, I'm 68 now, um, I want to be able to look back and say, Lord sakes, that was a ripper. That was a good life, well lived. A whole bunch of stuff happened that I surely never expected, but I did front up. I gave it my darndest. And I have been loved, and I have loved, and I have endeavored to love always.
I'm going to end with a Petrea King quote. May I quote you? I read this and I went, oh, this is beautiful. It says, love turns up, preferably with a casserole in hand. I just love that quote.
Yeah,
It
because
is.
love turns up when it doesn't know what to say and it doesn't know what to do. Because sometimes we're faced with extraordinary anguish,
Mm,
and it's not easy company. You have to be willing to face your own helplessness, your own powerlessness to change what's happening to someone that you care deeply about. But the willingness to turn up and bear witness to the anguish
mm,
and provide a space in which people can utter the unutterable is a service in itself, because it's no longer a private anguish. It's now an anguish that has been captured and brought into words or into sobs or into whatever it is. And as soon as we can move that feeling, we know we're already more than it. So it's not about fixing it, changing it, making it better, because you and I choose to be in an arena where you cannot fix it, you cannot change it, you cannot make it better, but you can turn up. And that's what love does.
that's what love does. Petrea, thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Touch my heart so much. We'll talk again soon, I hope.
Lovely. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.